I am coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts. My name is Christopher Setterland, and this is episode 8. So how's everybody doing out there this week? How's everyone doing on their New Year's resolutions? We're nearing the end of January. I know this is about the time of the year that people will go back on them. You know, once you hit that first snag, that first bump in the road. My resolution, or at least one of them, was to drop the COVID-15. It's been tough. Not tough like I'm giving up, but tough like, it's hard to stay focused on these goals. Changing your diet, especially when you like to eat like I do, is terrible. I've added a lot more greens, salads, veggies. I threw away my salt just like Coach KO told me to do. It went right in the trash. And the other way we help lose weight is by exercising more. I train people. I love doing that. Sometimes, though, it's hard to separate training others and working on their health and fitness and training yourself. And that's one thing I'm trying to get better at or get back to in 2021. In these days of COVID where it's still going on, I know a lot of people are worried about going to the gym. So I wanted to give a little, review. So I go to a Planet Fitness gym. They have a thing where it's called Crowd Meter. You have their app and you can go on it and you can see how full the gym is based on, CDC recommendations on how many people are allowed in a gym. So if you feel worried about going there with a lot of people around, you can wait for a time where there's less. I like going later in the morning or early to mid-afternoon to avoid the crowds. When you go there, everybody is masked up. They've done a good job with that. There's tons of sanitation stations with the spray and paper towels. There are machines that are off limits to keep the social distancing up. And so far, I have found no issues with anything like that. I mean, you may have a problem if you go on the cardio machines and you're trying to run hardcore or do the elliptical hardcore and you have to keep your mask on. That may be a little bit tough for you. Luckily, I haven't been running hardcore in a couple of years, so that hasn't been a problem. And like Coach KO, Kaylin Orr, like she said a couple of episodes ago in her interview, it's good to find a buddy, someone to hold you accountable and motivate you to go to the gym. She has her boyfriend, Chris. I sometimes find my motivation comes from my Uncle Steve, and I saw him recently at the gym, and he is someone that has inspired me to work on my own fitness for a long time. He became a marathon runner in his 50s, and he has since run the Boston Marathon more than 10 times and done well for his age group. And he's someone that when I see him, he's always so full of positive energy. He knows what to say to get that fire going in me, whether it has to do with the actual gym and training or working on this podcast. He was so excited to hear I was doing this that it got me motivated to add some more to it, which is something that'll be coming up for the next episode. I'm not going to switch up my format that quickly. But not to leave you hanging, it has something to do with the This Week in History segment. That's all I'll say. You'll have to tune into episode 9. But yeah, I wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to my Uncle Steve for giving me that positive energy and positive reinforcement, but also give a little bit of a shout out to the Planet Fitness gyms that have done such a good job with their sanitation and cleanliness, making sure these people have masks on, making sure that the machines, you can work out safely, spaced out from everyone. Just in case anyone is thinking of going back to the gym or wants to go back to the gym to kind of add to any fitness or weight loss goals for the new year. I just wanted to make sure I kind of told you because I'm doing it. Like I said at the top, this is episode 8 of the In My Footsteps podcast. I wanted to first give a big thank you to everyone who has listened to all the episodes, any of them leading up to this. My last 4 episodes in a row have each become my most downloaded in its first week. And it's a really great feeling. It's an upward trajectory, and I'm really enjoying creating this content for all of you. And obviously, if you have any ideas, suggestions, comments, compliments are always good too. But you can always shoot me an email, christophersetterland@gmail.com. You can find me on all of my social media platforms. I'd love to hear what people think of what this is. The downloads are great. People sharing it word of mouth, that kind of makes me feel like people are enjoying it. But I don't know specifics. If you have anything specific, definitely give me a shout. So this week's episode, we're going to take a look back at WCVX TV-58, Cape Cod's own television station. We're going to take a road trip up north to the little beautiful town of Lincoln, New Hampshire. I'm going to actually do my 1991 30 years ago year in music review that I had promised to do a couple of episodes ago, but my Vegas story sounded funnier at the time. And we've got This Week in History, including the Beatles' famed rooftop concert. So everyone, enjoy whatever you're doing. If you're taking a walk, if you're sitting on your couch, if you're cooking dinner, enjoy this episode of the In My Footsteps podcast, and come on, let's go take a walk. Growing up on Cape Cod as a child of the 80s, there were a lot of things that were going on and happening, that background noise and events. As I got older, I didn't appreciate things when I was younger. The history of Cape Cod, the history of my family, the history of New England. My grandmother, especially my Nana, she was the one that would always share how deeply connected we were to Cape Cod. And I didn't care until we got much older and I started researching the family to give her some more information about our family tree. It was more for her than me. And then I got into it. I started enjoying the research. And as I got older, I started doing writing for different outlets, especially CapeCod.com. I started doing Cape Cod history pieces, and I was writing about things that I was interested in, things that I wanted to learn about, like the old Cape Cod Coliseum that I'll talk about at some point, old restaurants and nightclubs and events. One thing that always reminded me of my Nana in those days when I would go to visit her Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, usually a couple days a week, during dinner, we would watch TV and watch the news. But instead of watching the news from Boston, we would usually watch the news from Cape Cod, which I know. I don't know how many of you know that back in the day, we had our own television station. The station was WCVX, and this is its story. So on Monday, January 16th, 1984, the station began. The call letters originally were W58AO, and it launched as a 12,000-watt outlet on Vineyard Haven on Martha's Vineyard. That's the night that Cape News 58 was first anchored by Francis Broadhurst and Mike Gwynn. The station itself was owned by WQRC and their head, Don Moore. He had been working for years to try to get a low-powered television station on Cape Cod. Don Moore was really committed to getting this off the ground. In fact, he was forced to sell WQRC due to the FCC regulations that stated individuals could not own television and radio stations in the same market. So he sold WQRC, and WF58AO went dark for a week as it changed its format from a 12,000-watt low-power station to a 1.2 million-watt station with a signal strength roughly equal to WLVI TV-56 and WSBK TV-38 out of Boston. The new WCVX debuted on July 19th, 1985. The signal remained assigned to Vineyard Haven, although the main operations would begin to take place out of Hyannis. And it actually started with reruns of classic TV shows like Mary Tyler Moore, The Fugitive, The Bob Newhart Show, and half-hour blocks of CNN news. But there was original programming too. So back when it first came out, WCVX had shows like Senior Forum, hosted by Dr. James Peace. There was a business show called Common Sense, with sense spelled CENTS. Good Morning Cape Cod, which was broadcast live from the Cape Cod Mall every Wednesday. I would have loved to have been there to see that. I can't find any videos of it. And then there was Cape 11 Alive News, That was kind of the one that I became most known with. As a kid, having dinner at my Nana's house and watching Cape 11 Alive, those people, some of the ones on the station at the time were like Dave Reed, who is a huge name in Cape Cod radio. Mark Mumford was one of the main hosts of Cape 11 Alive. Other future big name people came out of WCVX, like Doug Meehan and Bob Halloran, that both went on to work in Boston. Dave Reed was only on the station for a short time, but I remember speaking with him once, and he said that he was on there just long enough that he would be noticed in Stop and Shop, that people recognized him. Bob Halloran took over the sports desk at Channel 58 when Mike Gwynn went to work at Channel 12 in Providence. And there were some big events on Cape Cod that got covered back then during the Channel 58 days. Hurricane Gloria, that hit in September of '85. That was a big one. There was President George H.W. Bush coming to Cape Cod in 1990. They covered them landing at Otis Air National Guard Base. There were also the first run Cape Cod commercials. Now, children of the 80s and people that are my age and older might remember certain ones. The one that I always remember was the Tiki Port commercial. You can find that still on YouTube. It's a classic slice of 80s Cape Cod. You've got to go find that on YouTube. Just put in Tiki Port commercial and you'll find it. And remember, I know you'll remember. But for all of the efforts of Channel 58, there was a problem that they weren't being carried on a lot of homes. So in the first couple of years that it was out, WCVX was only available in about 40% of Cape Cod homes, with Cape Cod Cablevision initially refusing to carry it. TV-58 didn't achieve total Cape Cod coverage until August 10th, 1987. That's when Campbell Cable, which served Bourne and Sandwich, added the station. Unfortunately, that coverage came a little too late. The station was already in financial peril, with Don Moore having spent a lot of his own money to keep that station afloat. And when he couldn't find other potential investors, that kind of sealed the deal. In October 1987, Moore sold the station to Century Federal Savings Bank, and the viewership increased somewhat. According to surveys at the time, 60% of Cape Cod residents said they tuned into Channel 58 at least once in a while. And although they did a great job with the local reporting and the shows and the commercials, the whole problem with Channel 58 came down to money. By 1990, in October of 1990, WCVX let 10 employees go in cost-cutting measures. They dropped their total number of employees from 45 in 1988 to only 8 people. And they revamped their news format, but it was too little too late. The last gasp of Channel 58 came on July 2nd, 1991, with a showing of the 1955 film Kentucky Rifle, starring Chill Wills. And after that, it went dark, and it remained dark for 3 years. Eventually, it was bought by Boston University to be rechristened WZBU. It was an affiliate of BU's WABU station. In 1999, it was bought by Pax TV, which later became Ion TV. Don Moore, despite losing a lot of money and having to sell the station, he landed on his feet. He launched Ocean 104, the radio station, in 1994. There was Ed Semprini, who had a hugely successful career both before and after Channel 58. He became known as the Dean of Cape Cod Journalists, in addition to being called the Voice of Cape Cod. Obviously, I mentioned Dave Reed. He's still on the radio. Doug Meehan has been an anchor on WCVB Channel 5 since 2015, and same with Bob Halloran. But the memories remain. Do any of you out there remember WCVX Channel 58, Cape 11 Alive? Were any of you there for Good Morning Cape Cod? I'd love to try to find that. If you go on YouTube and look up WCVX, there are several videos. They're mostly outtakes, but several videos of film from back then. Even though the station was only on the air for 5 or 6 years, I still remember it fondly. I remember the news. I remember the commercial. I told you, the Tiki Port one, you've got to go find. Go out of your way. But that was the story of Cape Cod's own television station that we had for a handful of years back in the 80s and early 90s, WCVX TV-58. Though its run was brief, it definitely left an indelible mark on Cape Cod. Before we go on, I just wanted to give a special thank you to the sponsor of this week's episode, Cape Hook Designs. As I say at the top of the podcast, Cape Cod is a popular vacation destination, and it is a place filled with so many people that have grown up here, raised their children here, grandchildren here, and now it is possible to show your love of the Cape, wear the Cape, take the Cape with you with Cape Hook Designs. Based in Yarmouthport, Massachusetts, Cape Hook Designs is run by locals Brian and Jen Huggins, who have grown up here and are raising their family here now. Their clothing and jewelry features an instantly recognizable logo that will show people where you're from. They have bracelets, clothing, hats, decals for your car, and a lot more. They have a deep love and respect for Cape Cod, its residents, its history, and it comes through in their products. They also offer direct-to-garment printing, which is a specialty. Go to their website, capehookdesigns.com, and see some of their wonderful products they have. Featured on the front page is their football bass hoodie. You have to see it. You'll really enjoy it. I think that's one of their top sellers. In addition to their website, you can also find their products in such Cape Cod locations as Just Picked on Willow Street in Yarmouthport, Port Cargo on Main Street in Hyannis, All Good in the Cape Cod Mall, in the Cape Cod Calling, Monthly Mystery Box, and many more. So go to their website, check out where they sell in actual retail stores, and really get a feel for this way for you to show your love for Cape Cod, support a couple from the Cape, grown up on the Cape. There's beautiful craftsmanship, and the designs will be something you will love to show off to people that live on the Cape, have visited the Cape, or don't even know about the Cape. Contact Brian and Jen Huggins. Let them know you heard about them on the In My Footsteps podcast. I'm sure that will bring a smile to their faces. Cape Hook Designs. Definitely give them a shot. All right, it's time to go way back in the day. Once again, as we do on each podcast, this episode I'm going to fulfill the promise that I had from a few weeks ago. I'm going to talk about the year 1991 in music. This is the year that I consider to be the best year of music of my life, and maybe that's because it's the year that the music really started to speak to me and kind of form who I was, especially as a teenager. I was 13 when 1991 started, and I think that goes for anybody listening, whatever age you are. There's a certain year that becomes kind of the trigger point that it turns on your consciousness as far as music and the lyrics and the sound meaning more than just background noise on the radio. In full disclosure, and I'm sure any of you that have listened to any of the previous episodes of this podcast have heard me say that as a teenager of the 1990s, I gravitated towards the grunge alternative movement. That meant having torn blue jeans and flannel shirts. I had a red flannel shirt that I wore all the time. It was even in my senior photo in my yearbook, I'm wearing a red flannel shirt. But for me, it was the raw, visceral, I guess all the people that sung the grunge alternative songs, they weren't all teenagers. They were mostly in their 20s, but they kind of gave off that teenage angst feel. That's what I would feel. I don't know why. Most teenagers, you get that, I think, kind of angry at the world. You want to do what you want, and you still can't do it yet because you're not an adult, quote unquote. But for this, I'm not going to list all the albums in order or anything like that. It's more of just the feelings that I got and just bringing up all of these great albums by great artists that all came out in the same year, that they didn't all change the world, and maybe some of them didn't even change the world at the time, but it's incredible for me. I challenge anyone, when you talk about best years of music of my lifetime, I can't find one any better than 1991. I'll go into greater detail in a future podcast about the Nirvana album Nevermind, and that being the whole genesis of everything as far as wanting to be a singer-songwriter and just a writer in general, and the influence Kurt Cobain had on me. But for right now, I'm just going to bring it up that was the album that kind of changed everything. It was this seminal moment in music. And at the time when it first came out, it didn't really hit that hard. It took a few months for it to kind of gain steam, but then eventually it knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous album out of the top spot on the Billboard 200. And there was a whole big thing about that where not only did Nirvana knock Michael Jackson out, but they basically killed hair metal too, which that wasn't a bad thing. That was the big album for me. When I think 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind comes to the forefront. I actually have a copy of the vinyl album. I don't have a record player, so I could never play it, but I have it. I think that's the only vinyl album I currently have. You can't talk about Nirvana without talking about Pearl Jam's 10. That was the other real big one as far as the grunge movement. They both exploded from Seattle, and roughly about the same time. Nirvana had Smells Like Teen Spirit was their first big song, and Pearl Jam, their first song that actually came out was Alive, but it was their second one, Jeremy, that the video was wild. It was basically about a school shooting, a kid getting bullied. It was wild, the video. Even now looking back, Eddie Vedder looked like he was insane when he was singing. And when Nirvana and Pearl Jam kind of knocked the door down and the grunge alternative movement came to the mainstream, well, the mainstream found the movement. It allowed other bands that had actually already been out to get a little bit of a second life. Soundgarden, their second album, Bad Motorfinger, came out in 91, but they actually had an album before that. The Smashing Pumpkins had Gish. That was their debut album, but it didn't break through. It wasn't until they had Siamese Dream in 93 that they really broke through. But it's one of those things, you find this new form of music, and it's like, it's not just two bands. There's a lot more. And their success, Nirvana and Pearl Jam, allowed a lot of these other bands to kind of break through once the door was down. Obviously, I could go on and on about grunge music and the year 1991 in grunge, but there were so many more albums that came out that year. I can't go on without talking about U2's Achtung Baby. That album really blew my mind. I knew who U2 was because they had been around for over 10 years, and obviously the Joshua Tree was a huge album. But Achtung Baby, I think, is almost a perfect album. In my opinion, every song just has a different feel, and you can listen to the thing straight through. The song One by U2 has basically been my favorite song since it debuted in 1991. It's funny, most people don't know that. They would assume it was Smells Like Teen Spirit, but that's not true. One just speaks to me. And the way that I know that it's my favorite is that I don't listen to it that often, so that each time I do, it's kind of a special occasion. You don't want to always eat your favorite food or always watch your favorite movie, because then it's not as special. You kind of save it for special occasions. Metallica released their Black album, which basically, that brought them to mainstream. They had been around, obviously, for almost 10 years also. Enter Sandman was it was a great song, but the video was kind of creepy with the strobe light and James Hetfield and his long hair. Not as scary as Metallica's song One, which the video freaked the hell out of me, with the poor guy, the soldier that's in the hospital bed with the mask on his head. Ugh, I was 11 years old. That scared the hell out of me. And then there was Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I've mentioned before that when I did the back in the day about the old school clothing brands, that I said the music that the cool kids listened to, as far as back like in middle school, it was Red Hot Chili Peppers and Beastie Boys, where like if you listened to them, you were on the cutting edge. And the Chili Peppers had been around for several years before, but it was Blood Sugar Sex Magic and the song Under the Bridge that really crossed them over. That's kind of the theme with 1991. There's some bands that debuted and crossed over. There's some bands that had been established and finally broke through. And that maybe it's just my perception of coming of age that year. Then we've got Guns N' Roses, who released a double album, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. Use Your Illusion 1 was a red illustration and Use Your Illusion 2 was a blue one. And I remember I bought both of the cassettes. That was another big thing. 91 was the first year that I actually started buying CDs. So the funny thing is, boy, the music company got a lot of my money. I had the tapes of Pearl Jam's 10, both the Use Your Illusion albums, REM's Out of Time, and then I ended up buying the CDs also. So they got me there. I think I still have Pearl Jam's 10 and Nirvana's Nevermind on CD. And we're talking 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago, depending on the time of year it is. And the CDs have CD rot. It's like they look like they're pixelated, like someone started scraping the shine off of them. I don't know if any of you have CDs out there that are that old where now I can't play them even if I wanted to. But when speaking about 1991 and the year in music, I keep coming back to the grunge alternative movement. That's where it all goes because it opened my eyes. The loud thrashing guitars, pounding drums, the feedback, the screaming. Kurt Cobain was great at that. It opened my eyes and ears and mind. And the years that followed, you had Stone Temple Pilots. I discovered Alice in Chains the next year. I discovered Smashing Pumpkins in 93. And still later on, I would discover bands like Live and Green Day. The funny thing about Green Day is their Dookie album from 1994. I was 16 when it came out. And my niece Emma actually was the same age, 16, listening to that album that I listened to when I was 16, which it's a fun little full circle and shows that I kind of corrupted her taste in music a little. But what year do you consider the best in music of your lifetime? I'm sure some of you might say 91, but everyone's taste is different. What was it about that year that made it the best? Was it just the music, or was it something in your life kind of at the time that, you know, the music kind of influenced the life experiences and they kind of flow one into the other? That helped out for me as well. I was in 7th grade during 1991. And I often find myself gravitating back towards that music in these days, looking for that same drive. It was like you were motivated by that music, and I look for that still sometimes these days. But I hope you enjoyed going back in the day, at least back in my day, 1991, the year in music. That was a quick little trip through that year. I'll be doing more on some of those albums as we go along for 30th anniversaries and such. But yeah, go flip on some of that music. Go on Spotify or Pandora. Find some of those songs and kind of close your eyes and imagine teenage me going crazy as my eyes were opened to this new wave of music. It's road trip time again. This is the part of the podcast where I showcase one of the hundreds and hundreds of amazing towns and cities that New England has to offer. I give a little bit of history, but it's more of why you should go, what you can see, things you can do there. And I'll tell you, the vast majority of these places that I'm going to share as we go along on the podcast are all places that I've been to. And you can tell when I talk about them that I'm trying to persuade you to go. And I swear they're not paying me to say it. I just really enjoy them. But as we go, every now and then there'll be a place that I'll throw in that I haven't been to. And it's going to be like I'm trying to persuade myself to go there. So, speaking of persuading you to go places, this week I wanted to talk about a spot that I really love. It's so much fun. Up in central New Hampshire is a town called Lincoln, a little town. Ski town, hiking town. There's so much to see there. It's 2 hours north of Boston and about 60 or so miles south of the Canadian border. So it's up there, but it's not too bad. It's not way up like if you were to go to northern Maine where it seems like you're at the North Pole. As of 2019, the population in Lincoln is only 1,762 people. It's small. When you drive up that far into New Hampshire, the highway, you get to the point where exits are 20 miles in between sometimes, and you get kind of a warning, like last exit for 1,000,000 miles. So that's where you get to up there. The main highway up there is I-93, but there's also Route 3 that kind of parallels it. And when I went up there, this was in 2012. I went up to stay there, and I'll get on to why I was up there. But I stayed at a place called the Pemmy Cabins at 460 Route 3 in Lincoln. These cabins are right on the Pemigewasset River, and I loved it. There was a little screened-in porch that was right over the water, and you could just sit out there in the dark with the water rushing by. And I went and I stayed there, and there's a lot of stuff right around there centrally located. Now, I went up there because I was a runner. I'm not a runner anymore from injury purposes, but I was a runner, and I thought it would be cool to run the Kancamagus Highway. So Kancamagus Highway is reason enough to go up there. It's over 34 miles long, and it goes along Route 112. It starts in Lincoln and ends in North Conway. It goes through the White Mountains, and the highest peak in there is just under 3,000 feet high. So what I did was I drove out to Kancamagus Pass, the highest point, parked my car, and then decided to run. I ran 4 miles east, and then I ran 4 miles back west. So east was going downhill, west was going uphill. My idea was, wow, I'm going to go run this. It's going to be like running a mountain, which it was, and maybe I'll see a bear, maybe I'll see a moose. But being smart, I did it with headphones on. So here I am running along this very, very secluded road. There's no gas stations, restaurants, hotels, no cell service out there. And I'm hoping to see a bear or a moose because I'm super smart and didn't think ahead. And I'll never forget this. So I did my run, got back to my car. I was sore. My hip flexors were sore from running straight uphill for 4 miles. I didn't see any wild animals at all. The next morning, I went to this awesome little breakfast place called Flapjacks. That's located at 149 Main Street. I'm sitting there at the counter. I got my flapjacks, just like you should if you go there. And people come in, there's a couple of truckers, and they're talking about they heard that morning someone had hit a moose with their semi on the Kancamagus Highway, not far from where I was. As much as I would have liked to have seen a moose, I would not want to have seen a moose get hit by a 18-wheeler. Definitely drive the Kancamagus Highway, though, if you get a chance, if you're up in Lincoln. Another reason to go up there, well, there's several. If you're a skier, you can go to Loon Mountain, or you can go to the Hobo Railroad and Clark's Bears and Whale's Tail Amusement Park. Those are more summer things. I went up there for the Kancamagus Highway. I also went up there to go to Flume Gorge. When I was a kid, I'd say 11 years old, my Aunt Kelly took me up to Flume Gorge. I was the oldest, well, I'm still the oldest kid, and I was allowed to go on these cool adventures with her and her then husband, Mark. And I remember the rest of the kids in the family were jealous because I would get to go off and do these things and they couldn't yet. And we went to the Flume, and I got to see the Old Man in the Mountain. If you're not familiar with the Old Man in the Mountain, unfortunately, I'll tell you it's not there anymore. It's basically a rock formation that looked like an old man's face. It's this series of ledges in the side of Cannon Mountain, and you would go and just gaze upon it, and it was really neat. It looked like an old man's face. It was first noted in 1805 and collapsed in 2003, so I was lucky that I got to go see it. If you go now, they have these sticks or poles that have an outline of the face on it, and you can kind of step back and it'll line up to where the Old Man in the Mountain used to be, so you can kind of go and it's the best you can do. Flume Gorge is located at 852 Daniel Webster Highway in Lincoln. It's a natural gorge that extends 800 feet from the base of Mount Liberty, and it's got walls up the sides. As you walk, there's walkways and stairways to kind of get you as close to the top as you can. But the walls extend between 70 and 90 feet high up alongside you, and it's really neat. The walls are sometimes only 12 to 20 feet apart. It's like you're in this little hallway of granite. And there's a cool covered bridge that goes over the river there. It's like an hour and a half to do the whole walk around Flume Gorge. But that's definitely worth it, especially in summer. If you've been a listener to the podcast before, you'll know that in episode 6, I did a story about Betty and Barney Hill and their UFO abduction. That took place right around Lincoln. And it's funny, when I went up there in 2012, it was the first night I was there at the Pemmy Cabins, and I needed, snacks at the store. And there was a convenience store, a quarter mile down the road. It's an Irving gas station. I went there to get some stuff, and there's a mural next to the entranceway of the convenience store, and it depicts this little gray alien. There's a spaceship behind him, and it says the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, and it gives the date 1961. I took a picture of it, not thinking anything of it. And then when I started doing this podcast and I was looking for ideas of things to talk about around New England, I was going through my old photos, and I pulled up this photo of the mural with the alien, And that's how I discovered Betty and Barney Hill. That mural is still there. I believe it's protected with plexiglass now. It wasn't when I was there, but I don't know if people started drawing on it because that's what they tend to do. Franconia Notch State Park is the spot where the Old Man of the Mountain was located. I thought I might give you the address there too, so you're not just driving around, although that's fun too. It's 260 Tramway Drive, and it's on the Lincoln-Franconia border. It still counts as Lincoln. It's great for skiing. It's great for hiking. It's great for stargazing. I mean, when you're up there in northern New Hampshire at night, there's not a lot of ambient light to distract you from the stars. It's got the Kancamagus Highway. It's got amusement parks in the summer. Like I said, skiing in the winter. Lincoln, New Hampshire, you can go there anytime. Right now, well, maybe not right now. Once the pandemic is over, go up there and visit, take pictures of the mural for Betty and Barney Hill, and just explore. Northern New Hampshire is incredible. Just make sure that you have a full tank of gas because the exits, like I said, sometimes they're few and far between. 2 hours north of Boston, about 3.5 hours north of Hartford, Connecticut. It's definitely worth the visit, Lincoln, New Hampshire. I loved it. I can't wait to go back there, and I hope that I've tempted you just enough to go and give them a shot. For more information, check out lincolnnh.org. That'll help you. And join me again for another road trip where I'm going to find another incredible city or town in New England to share with all of you. It is time once again for This Week in History. We're going to go and check out 4 different stories, local, national, world, and pop culture. Give you a little idea of what was going on this planet in this week in the past. So, let's jump right in and get started. This Week in History, 112 years ago, on January 23rd, 1909, the RMS Republic sank off the coast of Nantucket. The Republic was built in 1903, was 570 feet long, and considered to be much like later on the Titanic, to be unsinkable. The big thing here that connects it to the area here, Cape Cod, New England, is that this ship was equipped with the wireless transmitter that connected it to the Marconi station. The Republic struck another ship called the Florida about 50 miles off the coast of Nantucket, and this put the wireless transmitter into play. A man named John R. Binns became the first to send out the CQD distress signal, and this signal picked up at the Marconi station in Wellfleet helped to assist the ship and rescue the lot of the passengers, a lot of which were transferred over to the Florida ship, which was less damaged. They were then transferred to another ship and towed away to safety. However, the Republic did not last. The next day, it actually sank in the waters 50 miles off of Nantucket. Now, why this is important is because of what went down with the ship. None of the people did, but since the ship was seen as unsinkable, when the passengers all got removed from the ship, none of the cargo did. And this was a rich ship, a lot of wealthy people on it. So in other words, what went down with the ship was supposedly, legend has it, a big-time cash flow that included a secret shipment of gold consigned to the Tsar of Russia, along with a 5-ton shipment of American Eagle gold coins. If all of this is true, and people have said that it is, the treasure that is down there off of Nantucket is worth today over $1 billion. In 1981, Martin Bay-Earl, who owned a scuba diving shop on the island of Martha's Vineyard, spearheaded the efforts to locate the Republic. In 1987, after raising $2.5 million for his efforts, he actually spent 74 days down there looking around the wreckage of the Republic. The main things he found were badly damaged bottles of champagne and some china. Thus far, he has not found any of the supposed $1 billion treasure, but in 2011, the Massachusetts court confirmed that Bay-Earl has the rights to salvage to the Republic. So in other words, if the treasure's there, he's going to be the one that's going to get it. But on this day, this week in history, 112 years ago, the RMS Republic became the first ship to use the distress signal wireless and actually rescued all of the people off the ship, but not the treasure. This week in history, 35 years ago, January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after liftoff from Cape Canaveral in Florida. It killed all 7 crew members, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, who was going to teach lessons while in space. This was the second shuttle ever to reach space, and it was actually its 10th launch. The first shuttle to ever go into space was the Columbia, which launched April 12th, 1981. The night before, the temperature dipped below freezing, which degraded the seal on the rocket boosters, which most believe contributed to the explosion, which was seen live on television. It was a big deal that a civilian, a teacher, Krista McAuliffe, was going to be going into space. Krista McAuliffe was important for 2 reasons. First, she's from New England. She was born in Concord, New Hampshire. And for me, I was in 2nd grade when this occurred. So it was important to see a teacher go into space. Now, granted, I didn't get to see it live. We weren't able to get a TV into the classroom, but I do remember that shortly after noon, so the Challenger exploded around 11:40 a.m., but shortly after noon, Principal Mr. MacArthur at South Yarmouth Elementary School came on the PA system to alert us as best he could that the shuttle Challenger had exploded. It had to be hard to try to explain it to kids I was 8 years old, but try to explain it and have kids process it. I don't know if I processed it at the time. I saw the explosion when I got home on CNN, but it was one of those seminal moments in history for the 1980s. If you were alive and you could remember, everyone remembers what happened when the shuttle Challenger exploded. So NASA shut down the space shuttle program after that to figure out what went wrong. And it took until September of 1988 for space shuttle travel to continue, and that was the shuttle Discovery. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last space shuttle disaster. In February 2003, the space shuttle Columbia would also explode as it disintegrated when it re-entered the atmosphere. This week in history, 35 years ago, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster happened and changed the space program forever. This week in history, 139 years ago, January 25th, 1882, Charles Guiteau was found guilty and sentenced to death for the assassination of President James Garfield. Guiteau was a 41-year-old mentally unstable lawyer, and he had actually been stalking Garfield for months before shooting him at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., on July 2nd, 1881. So Guiteau's problem was he was a lawyer, he was crazy, but he started doing political speeches. He believed that he had played an important part in the election of James Garfield. He made speeches to very small crowds, but his insanity and his narcissistic personality made him believe that he had contributed, and when his opinion of Garfield soured as the months went on, he decided that the only way to make things right was to eliminate Garfield and elevate Chester A. Arthur to president. He shot Garfield twice, but Garfield hung on for 6.5 months. And it's possible that he developed an infection from all these doctors trying to fish into the wound and get the bullet out with unwashed hands, which is gross. And when you hear about how President Garfield suffered through the months as he slowly died, it's really, So Guiteau defended himself in court, naturally, because he was a lawyer. And obviously that didn't help. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, and he was hanged on June 30th, 1882. Sadly, presidents back then, Garfield, he didn't have any real protection. Abraham Lincoln, before he died, had signed into law the Secret Service in 1865. But in reality, the Secret Service didn't actually come around to protect presidents until 1894. So a lot of the presidents, it was just a normal person walking around. You might have bodyguards, but obviously, as seen here, it wasn't enough protection. And this week in history, 139 years ago, Charles Guiteau was found guilty of the assassination of President Garfield and sentenced to death. This week in history, 52 years ago, January 30th, 1969, the Beatles held their famous rooftop performance on the top of the Apple Corp headquarters during the early production of their Let It Be album. This performance is extremely famous in the world of music and pop culture. It turned out to be the Beatles' last performance ever, with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr also performing with Billy Preston. The 42-minute set included 9 takes of 5 songs from the upcoming Let It Be album. They included Get Back, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, Don't Let Me Down, and Dig a Pony. Naturally, it caused some chaos, and people that were walking by or people out on their lunch break hearing live Beatles music, it must have been wild to hear that and then see them up there performing. And they were bundled up. It's cold. It's England in January. But after just over 40 minutes of playing, the Metropolitan Police eventually came and told them to turn it down, which put an end to the impromptu concert. The performance would become a big part of the Let It Be film, and they thought it would be an interesting idea to kind of use a hidden camera to see people's reactions as the Beatles started playing. The performance ended with John Lennon saying, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope that we've passed the audition." It would be the last Beatles performance ever. Let It Be would be released in 1970. Abbey Road actually came out before it, even though it was recorded technically after Let It Be. By the end of 1969, the Beatles were officially disbanded, and all 4 went on to have very successful solo careers. But this week in history, 52 years ago, the iconic rooftop performance occurred with the Beatles playing their last concert. And that'll do it for this week in history. Very eventful week. Beatles, a presidential assassination, a sad space shuttle disaster, and a treasure off the coast of Nantucket that may or may not be there. Tune in again next week when I'll have some more interesting history topics for you. Who knows what'll happen. And that's going to do it for episode 8 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this one. This was the end of my 3-week run of doing consecutive weekly podcasts. So there won't be one next week. There'll be one the week after. I'm trying to see, like I said, the workload, what it takes to do this podcast. I have to research it, obviously record it, edit it. I also take one of the segments and turn them into a YouTube video, which I then share. And you can go over and subscribe to my videos on YouTube. Once it gets warmer, I'll be doing more of the 4K New England videos. It's not as much fun going out and shooting videos across New England when it's winter and everything's bare. Unless there's snow on stuff, then it looks pretty good. And after doing all of that, the YouTube video, I get to transcribe the podcast. If you've never tried transcribing something from talk to text, it's super fun. It's essentially everything I say here will then be loaded into a single document, and it's like one long run-on sentence. I think the one I did for episode 7 was 10,000 words. So it's a 10,000 word sentence with a lot of misspellings because the AI can sometimes mishear things. It never gets my last name Setterland right. It's always wrong. It's a lot of work. The podcasting stuff, there's a lot that goes into it, but it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. So I hope that you'll stick around and come back for episode 9. That'll be in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about one of the most famous storms in the history of New England, the blizzard of '78. I'm going to share part 2 of my living in Las Vegas story. Like I said I would. It's going to be the bus trip from Vegas back to Hyannis. That's appointment listening. And we'll do This Week in History with a little twist. Like I said at the top of the podcast, I don't want to spoil it. It'll be something fun. It's a fun edition. That's all I'll say. So find me on social media. I got a Facebook page, In My Footsteps Podcast. Twitter, Chris Setterland is my handle. You can find me on Instagram, either my personal account, Christopher Setterland, or the In My Footsteps podcast account, either or. Go to my blog on Blogger, the In My Footsteps blog. The most recent article that I posted was about the Hangar Tea Room in Falmouth Heights, which was a tea room that also doubled as a speakeasy during Prohibition, so that's pretty fun. Visit my personal website, ChristopherSetterland.com. It has all 5 of my current books, and when book 6 is available at the end of May, that'll be tossed up there. You can also find the books on Amazon. You can find them at Schiffer Publishing and the History Press also, if you want to get them from the actual publisher. Check out my Zazzle store. As I've mentioned before, it's called Cape Cod Living. It has some podcast merch. I mean, we're talking bumper sticker, keychain. My Uncle Steve has recently said that maybe I should come up with something new, maybe a winter hat or a t-shirt or something like that. Is that something that would interest anybody? I'm not going to just make all these products with the logo of the podcast on it and have them just sit there and not get sold. That's sad. Special thanks again to my sponsor for the episode, Cape Hook Designs. You can find Jen and Brian's clothing, bracelets, hats, and more at capehookdesigns.com. Everybody stay safe out there. Vaccinations are starting to roll in as far as COVID goes. We're getting closer. Winter is almost half over. Hopefully in the spring, things will start to look up. But remember, in life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and enjoy every moment that you can on this journey. Take care, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.